Hi everyone, my name is Jake. Today I want to tell you about some of the most dangerous female killers in U.S. history. Case 1. Lisa Ann Coleman. On a summer morning in 2004, a 911 call came in from an apartment in Arlington, Texas. At first it sounded like a medical emergency, just a child having trouble breathing. But as responders arrived, what they found would later be described in courtrooms and reports as one of the most disturbing child abuse cases in the state's history. Authorities were called to the home on July 26, 2004. Inside, they discovered 9-year-old Devontai Williams unresponsive. According to emergency responders, it quickly became clear that he had already passed away hours earlier. His condition shocked even experienced paramedics. He was severely underweight and showed signs of prolonged neglect and injury. Later, medical examinations would play a crucial role in understanding what had happened in the weeks and months leading up to that day. At the time, Lisa Coleman was living in the apartment with Devontai's mother, Marcella Williams. The two women were in a romantic relationship and shared responsibility for the household. What investigators would later piece together suggested a deeply troubling environment, one that had already drawn the attention of authorities years before. In 1999, Child Protective Services had removed Devontai from his mother's care after allegations of physical abuse. According to records, he was eventually returned under a strict condition. He was not to have contact with Lisa Coleman. However, testimony later indicated that this restriction was not followed. Over time, the situation inside the home remained largely hidden from public view. When investigators examined Devontai's body, they documented extensive injuries. Medical professionals testified that there were more than 250 marks, wounds, and scars. These included signs consistent with repeated restraint, as well as injuries in various stages of healing. Experts noted that such a pattern suggested ongoing harm rather than a single incident. However, as with many forensic interpretations, conclusions were based on professional opinion and evidence presented in court. The official cause of death, according to the medical examiner, was severe malnutrition complicated by pneumonia. Doctors explained that prolonged lack of nutrition can weaken the immune system, making the body more vulnerable to infections. In this case, the combination proved fatal. Some defense experts offered alternative perspectives, suggesting other medical factors may have contributed, but ultimately, the court accepted the prosecution's findings. Witness testimony added further context. Devontai's younger sister described instances where he was restrained, sometimes with cords, limiting his ability to move. Coleman herself admitted during questioning that she had participated in restraining him on multiple occasions. She also acknowledged using physical punishment in the past, though she claimed it had stopped months before the boy's death. Another key issue raised during the investigation was isolation. Evidence suggested that Devontai had been withdrawn from school and kept out of public view. When others asked about him, explanations were given that he was staying with relatives. Prosecutors argued that this pattern prevented outside intervention, while defense attorneys questioned whether these actions met the legal definition of intentional concealment. In the final months of his life, there were indications that attempts were made to treat Devontai at home. Testimony mentioned over-the-counter medications, nutritional drinks, and basic care like bandages. However, medical experts stated that these efforts were insufficient and, in some opinions, came too late to reverse the damage. One expert suggested that such measures might also have delayed seeking professional medical attention, though intent behind these actions remained a point of legal debate. The case moved through the court system, where a jury ultimately found Lisa Coleman guilty of capital murder in 2006. The charge included an aggravating factor related to kidnapping, based on the argument that Devontai had been restrained and isolated in a way that prevented him from leaving or being helped. This classification made the case eligible for the death penalty under Texas law. During the sentencing phase, jurors were presented with additional details about Coleman's past, including prior convictions. These factors, combined with the severity of the case, led the jury to sentence her to death. Meanwhile, Marcella Williams accepted a plea agreement and received a life sentence, avoiding the death penalty. Over the following years, Coleman's legal team filed multiple appeals, challenging both the conviction and the sentence. They raised questions about the interpretation of evidence, the application of the kidnapping charge, and whether her actions met the legal threshold for intentional murder. Courts at both the state and federal levels reviewed these claims but ultimately upheld the original verdict. By 2014, all major appeals had been exhausted. An execution date was set for September 17th of that year. In the final hours, last-minute appeals were submitted, including a request for clemency. These efforts were denied. That evening, Lisa Coleman was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. Witnesses to the execution reported that she addressed family members and others present, expressing love and gratitude. Her final words included a statement that she was all right and that she had finished strong, followed by a religious remark. As with all such accounts, these details come from official reports and media witnesses present at the time. The case of Lisa Ann Coleman remains a deeply unsettling example of how abuse can go undetected behind closed doors. It also raises broader questions about systemic failures, how earlier warnings may not have been enough to prevent tragedy, and how agencies balance intervention with family rights. For many observers, the story is not only about the crime itself, but about the circumstances that allowed it to happen over time. It highlights the importance of vigilance from communities, institutions, and authorities when it comes to protecting vulnerable individuals. At the same time, discussions around the case often extend into debates about the death penalty, legal responsibility, and the complexities of shared culpability. What is clear is that the events of July 2004 had lasting consequences, affecting not only those directly involved but also shaping conversations about child protection and justice. Cases like this are often revisited not just to recount what happened, but to understand how similar tragedies might be prevented in the future. Case 2. Paula R. Cooper. On May 14, 1985, a crime unfolded in Gary, Indiana, that would shock a community, divide public opinion, and spark an international debate about justice, youth, and the death penalty. Paula Cooper was just 15 years old at the time of the crime. Born on August 25, 1969, she grew up in a troubled environment that, according to later court testimony, included instability, abuse, and frequent changes in schools. By the mid-1980s, she had already encountered legal trouble and was described as a runaway. These details would later play a role in how her case was interpreted, but they would not change the severity of what happened on that spring day in 1985. The victim, Ruth Pelk, was 78 years old. She was known in her neighborhood as a kind and religious woman who taught Bible lessons to local children. On the day of the murder, Cooper and 3 other teenage girls skipped school. According to case records, they spent time drinking alcohol and using marijuana before discussing ways to get money. Eventually, they decided to target Pelke, believing she might have valuables in her home. Using a pretense, the girls approached Pelke's house and asked about Bible lessons. Trusting them, she allowed them inside. What happened next was both sudden and brutal. According to court documents and Cooper's own statements, Pelke was attacked from behind, struck with a household object, and then stabbed multiple times. The number of stab wounds, reported as 33, became one of the most cited and disturbing aspects of the case. After the attack, the girls searched the house and left, with a small amount of money and car keys. The crime was quickly investigated, and the suspects were arrested within days. Cooper eventually pleaded guilty to murder and felony murder without a plea agreement. There was little dispute over her involvement. Instead, the legal focus shifted towards sentencing, and that's where the case took a dramatic turn. In July 1986, Paula Cooper was sentenced to death. At just 15 years old, she became the youngest person on death row in Indiana at the time. The decision immediately sparked controversy. Prosecutors argued that the severity of the crime justified the harshest possible punishment. The defense, however, emphasized her age, background, and the argument that she was capable of rehabilitation. The sentencing didn't just remain a local issue, it quickly became international. Advocacy groups, religious leaders, and human rights organizations began speaking out. Millions of signatures were gathered in petitions calling for clemency. The case even drew attention from global figures, highlighting the broader ethical question: should someone so young be eligible for the death penalty? At the same time, The legal landscape in the United States was evolving. Questions about juvenile sentencing, especially in capital cases, were being debated in courts across the country. Cooper's case became part of that larger conversation. In 1989, the Indiana Supreme Court revisited her sentence, citing both state and federal constitutional concerns, as well as changing standards around juvenile punishment. The court ruled that she could not be executed. Her sentence was reduced to 60 years in prison. This decision marked a turning point, not just for Cooper, but for how the justice system approached similar cases. The ruling reflected a growing recognition that age matters in determining criminal responsibility and punishment. While the crime itself remained undeniable, the question of how society should respond to juvenile offenders became more complex. Meanwhile, the impact of the crime extended far beyond the courtroom. For the victim's family, the loss was devastating. Ruth Pelk's grandson, Bill Pelk, initially supported the death penalty for Cooper. However, over time, his perspective changed. He became an advocate for forgiveness and spoke publicly about the emotional journey that led him to oppose her execution. His transformation became a widely discussed aspect of the case, adding another layer to an already complicated story. Inside prison, Cooper's life also evolved. Reports indicate that she pursued education, earning a GED and taking college-level courses. Her behavior and development over time were often cited by those who supported her eventual release. According to sentencing structures in Indiana, inmates could reduce their time through good behavior, which meant her actual time served might be significantly less than the original 60-year term. The case continued to be referenced in discussions about juvenile justice, capital punishment, and rehabilitation. It highlighted how a single crime could raise broader societal questions about accountability, fairness, and the possibility of change. Some viewed the commutation of her sentence as a necessary correction, while others believed it did not fully reflect the gravity of the crime. It's important to note that true crime stories like this one often exist at the intersection of fact and interpretation. While the core events are documented, the meaning people draw from them can differ widely. That's especially true in cases involving young offenders, where emotions and ethical considerations are deeply intertwined. Looking back, the Paula Cooper case stands as a powerful example of how the justice system can evolve. It forced courts, lawmakers, and the public to confront difficult questions about punishment and humanity. It also showed how individual stories, both of victims and offenders, can influence broader legal and cultural shifts. Case 3. Shannon Elizabeth Crawley. On a cold January morning in 2007, a quiet apartment complex in Durham, North Carolina, became the center of a case that would later be described as a tragic collision of relationships, emotions, and conflicting narratives. What began as an ordinary day quickly turned into a mystery that investigators, families, and eventually a jury would spend years trying to untangle. At the heart of it all was Shannon Elizabeth Crawley, a 911 dispatcher whose life would change forever after the death of 25-year-old graduate student Danita Monique Smith. According to prosecutors, the events leading up to the crime formed what they described as a perfect storm, driven by jealousy and a complicated love triangle involving a man named Jermier Stroud. However, the defense would later argue a very different version of events, painting Crawley not as the perpetrator, but as someone caught in a dangerous situation she could not control. On January 4, 2007, Danita Smith was found fatally shot at her apartment complex. She had been struck in the head and collapsed near a stairwell, where her body was later discovered by a maintenance worker. Authorities initially had few answers, but within days, their investigation led them to Shannon Crawley. She was arrested just 5 days after the murder, a rapid development that suggested investigators believed they had identified a key suspect early on. At the time, Crawley was working as a dispatcher in Greensboro, a role that placed her within the world of emergency response, ironically, the same system that would now be involved in her own case. As the investigation unfolded, a central theme quickly emerged, a relationship triangle involving Crawley, Smith, and Stroud, a police officer engaged to Smith but also romantically involved with Crawley. According to court testimony, Stroud had been maintaining relationships with both women, though the extent of what each woman knew about the other became a crucial and disputed point. Prosecutors argued that Crawley became consumed by jealousy after learning about Smith, leading her to allegedly stalk the victim and ultimately commit the crime. They claimed that Crawley had even visited the apartment complex before the murder, suggesting premeditation. However, Crawley told a very different story. She maintained her innocence from the beginning, insisting she did not know Smith and had no reason to harm her. Instead, she accused Stroud of being the true perpetrator. In her account, she claimed that he forced her to accompany him to Durham and that she was present when he confronted Smith. Crawley alleged that she remained in the car while Stroud approached the apartment and that she heard an argument followed by a gunshot. According to her testimony, he then returned to the vehicle and ordered her to drive away, threatening her and her children if she refused. These conflicting narratives would become the centerpiece of the trial, with each side presenting evidence to support its version of events. Prosecutors pointed to inconsistencies in Crawley's statements, arguing that she repeatedly changed her story and attempted to mislead investigators. They also highlighted claims that she tried to frame Stroud after the fact, including allegedly staging recorded phone conversations in which a man appeared to confess to the crime. Investigators later suggested these recordings were fabricated, a claim that became a major point of contention during the trial. The defense, on the other hand, focused on casting doubt on Stroud's role and credibility. They argued that he had a motive, given the complicated relationships, and suggested that the investigation had not fully explored his potential involvement. They also emphasized Crawley's claims of fear, stating that she believed her life and her children's lives were in danger. The courtroom became a battleground of narratives, with emotional testimony from both families adding to the intensity of the proceedings. Danita Smith's family spoke about the loss of a promising young woman whose life was cut short, while Crawley's family expressed their belief that she had been wrongly accused. The trial itself lasted several weeks, with jurors hearing detailed accounts from investigators, witnesses, and the defendant herself. One of the most debated pieces of evidence involved the recorded phone calls that Crawley claimed captured Stroud admitting to the crime. The defense argued these recordings supported her version of events, while prosecutors insisted they were staged and unreliable. The judge ultimately allowed the recordings to be presented, leaving it up to the jury to determine their credibility. After deliberating for approximately 7 hours over 2 days, the jury reached a verdict. Shannon Elizabeth Crawley was found guilty of first-degree murder. The decision marked a turning point in the case, bringing a sense of closure for some while deepening the sense of tragedy for others. Crawley was immediately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, emotions ran high. Members of Smith's family expressed a mixture of relief and grief, feeling that justice had been served but knowing it could never bring their loved one back. Crawley, according to reports, remained largely silent during sentencing, offering no public statement in that moment. Outside the courtroom, reactions continued to reflect the deep divisions in how the case was perceived. Some believed the evidence clearly pointed to Crawley's guilt, citing the inconsistencies in her story and the prosecution's narrative of jealousy-driven violence. Others, including members of her own family, maintained that she had been wrongly convicted and that the true story had yet to be uncovered. Even the judge acknowledged the complexity of the situation, noting that the relationships involved had created a chain of events with devastating consequences. The case also raised broader questions about investigative processes, the reliability of certain types of evidence, and how juries interpret conflicting testimonies. While the legal outcome was definitive, the debate surrounding the case has persisted in discussions among those who follow true crime stories. It serves as a reminder that even in cases with a clear verdict, public opinion can remain divided. Case 4. LaTosha Cunningham. On a quiet evening in May 2011, what should have been an ordinary night of routine and relaxation turned into a tragedy that would shock an entire community. LaTosha Cunningham, born on November 9, 1973, lived in Illinois and was known to frequent local bingo halls. According to investigators, it was within this familiar environment that events began to unfold. The victim, 85-year-old Yoko Cullen, was also a regular at these gatherings. Described as a quiet woman who enjoyed her routine, Cullen became the center of a crime that authorities would later characterize as both opportunistic and deeply disturbing. On May 18, 2011, Cullen attended a bingo session in Collinsville, Illinois. At some point after leaving the venue, she disappeared. Her family reported her missing the following day, and what followed was a rapidly intensifying investigation. Just 2 days later, Cullen's burned vehicle was discovered in East St. Louis, an area reportedly known for abandoned cars. Inside the trunk, authorities found human remains later identified as Cullen. Investigators would later present evidence suggesting that Cullen had been forced into the trunk of her own car. Forensic findings indicated that she was alive when the fire began, based on soot discovered in her airway. This detail became one of the most haunting aspects of the case, though it is important to note that such conclusions come from expert interpretation of forensic evidence presented during official proceedings. Within days, law enforcement identified 3 suspects: LaTosha Cunningham, along with Daquan Barnes and DeMarcus Barnes. All 3 were arrested shortly after Cullen's body was discovered. Authorities alleged that the group targeted Cullen after observing her at the bingo hall, believing she had money. According to statements introduced in court, the plan may have involved robbery, though there were conflicting accounts about whether the crime was premeditated or spontaneous. During interviews with police, Cunningham initially denied any involvement. However, prosecutors later stated that her account changed after she was confronted with statements from the other suspects. In her later version of events, she described being present during key moments but attempted to minimize her role. She claimed that she had stopped to assist Cullen when her car appeared to have mechanical issues and that the Barnes relatives then escalated the situation. According to these statements, Cullen was forced into the trunk and the group drove to a more isolated location. Testimony suggested that physical violence occurred during this time, allegedly in an attempt to obtain access to Cullen's finances. Afterward, the suspects reportedly acquired gasoline and returned to the scene where the car was set on fire. Authorities argued that this act was intended to destroy evidence. Another critical part of the prosecution's case involved the use of Cullen's financial information. Surveillance footage and banking records indicated that attempts were made to use her credit or debit cards in the days following her disappearance. Investigators linked these actions to the suspects through phone records and ATM images. Prosecutors argued that this demonstrated not only involvement in the crime, but also a financial motive. During the trial process, the roles of each suspect were examined in detail. Daquan Barnes eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 60 years in prison without the possibility of parole. DeMarcus Barnes was found mentally unfit to stand trial at the time, delaying further legal proceedings in his case. Cunningham, meanwhile, faced a bench trial where a judge reviewed the evidence without a jury. In October 2013, Cunningham was found guilty of murder. The judge considered multiple factors, including her presence at the scene, her actions after the crime, and her alleged participation in events leading up to Cullen's death. Prosecutors emphasized that even if Cunningham did not carry out every act herself, her involvement and failure to intervene contributed significantly to the outcome. On December 11, 2013, Cunningham was sentenced to 60 years in prison without parole. The judge stated that the severity of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim were key considerations in determining the sentence. The ruling effectively ensured that Cunningham would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The case also brought attention to Cunningham's past. Court records revealed that she had previously been convicted in 1993 for a violent robbery involving another elderly woman. In that earlier case, the victim survived, but the incident was used by prosecutors to argue a pattern of behavior. Cunningham had maintained her innocence in that prior conviction, claiming mistaken identity, but the jury at the time found otherwise. Beyond the courtroom, the case sparked broader discussions within the community. Many were struck by the apparent targeting of an elderly individual, raising concerns about the safety of vulnerable populations. Others questioned how such a crime could develop in a setting as ordinary as a bingo hall, a place typically associated with leisure and social connection. Media coverage of the case often highlighted the brutality of the crime, though it's worth noting that descriptions can vary in tone and detail depending on the source. While some reports focused on forensic and legal aspects, others included emotional commentary about the nature of the offense. As with many true crime stories, separating confirmed facts from interpretation is an important part of understanding what happened. Case 5. Venecia, Amalia, DePaula. On a quiet summer night in August 2009, a story unfolded in Hillsborough County, Florida, that would later be dissected in courtrooms and debated by those trying to understand how love, jealousy, and desperation can collide with devastating consequences. What is known is that a 29-year-old man named Felipe Perez lost his life, and his pregnant partner, Venecia Amalia DePaula, would ultimately be held responsible. What remains less clear, and what became the central focus of the trial, is why it happened and what was going through her mind in the moments leading up to it. By all outward appearances, their relationship had once been stable. They had been together for several years, shared a home, and were expecting a child. But beneath the surface, tensions had been building. Perez's life was complicated. Though separated, he was still legally married to another woman, and he had recently begun seeing someone new. According to testimony, he no longer considered himself to be in a relationship with DePaula, even though they continued living together. This disconnect between what one person believed and what the other accepted appears to have fueled a growing emotional strain. In the weeks leading up to the incident, messages exchanged between the two revealed unresolved conflict. There were accusations, questions about fidelity, and lingering emotional ties that had not fully been severed. At the same time, DePaula was reportedly 6 months pregnant, a factor that may have intensified her emotional state, though interpretations of her mindset would later vary depending on which side of the courtroom was speaking. The prosecution would argue that jealousy and fear of abandonment drove her actions. The defense, on the other hand, suggested that she was overwhelmed, depressed, and possibly not fully in control of herself at the critical moment. One of the most significant elements introduced during the trial was DePaula's effort to obtain a firearm shortly before the shooting. Records and testimony indicated that she first attempted to purchase a revolver from a gun shop, but was unable to complete the transaction immediately due to a waiting period. Instead of abandoning the idea, she acquired a 9mm Beretta semi-automatic handgun through a private sale just hours before the crime occurred. To prosecutors, this sequence of actions suggested planning and determination. To the defense, it was presented as evidence of her deteriorating emotional state, arguing that she may have intended to harm herself rather than anyone else. In the early hours of August 3, 2009, Perez returned to the apartment after spending time out. According to court testimony, he eventually fell asleep on the couch. What happened next would become the central and most disturbing fact of the case. DePaula approached him while he slept and fired a single shot at close range. There was no dispute in court about who pulled the trigger. Her own attorney acknowledged that she had done so. The real question was whether this act had been premeditated or whether it occurred in a moment of psychological breakdown. Following the shooting, DePaula's actions added another layer of complexity to the narrative. She gathered her young daughter and began driving toward Palm Beach County, where her family lived. During that journey, she reportedly contacted a friend and made statements suggesting regret and awareness of what had just occurred. Eventually, she went to a police station and turned herself in, telling officers that she had shot her boyfriend and believed she had killed him. This decision to surrender without attempting to evade law enforcement would later be highlighted by the defense as evidence that she was not acting with calculated intent, while prosecutors maintained that it did not erase the alleged planning that preceded the act. During the trial, jurors were presented with two competing interpretations of DePaula's state of mind. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who felt rejected and replaced, who could not accept the end of the relationship, and who made a deliberate choice to end Perez's life. They pointed to her acquisition of the weapon, the timing of the shooting, and the vulnerability of the victim as indicators of premeditation. The defense, however, argued that she was emotionally fragile, isolated from her support system, and struggling with the pressures of pregnancy and relationship turmoil. They suggested that she may have experienced a mental blackout or dissociative episode, meaning she was not fully aware of her actions at the time. Notably, DePaula did not testify in her own defense, leaving jurors to rely on second-hand interpretations of her mental and emotional condition. When the verdict was delivered, she showed little visible reaction, at least according to those present in the courtroom. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, indicating that they were convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the act had been premeditated. The judge, in sentencing her to life in prison, described the crime as cold and brutal, emphasizing the irreversible nature of the loss. The emotional impact of the case extended beyond the defendant and the victim. Family members on both sides were left to grapple with the consequences. Perez's estranged wife, who remained in contact with him prior to his death, expressed sympathy not only for her own loss, but also for DePaula's children, who would grow up without their mother. DePaula's own mother became responsible for raising her grandchildren, including the baby born while DePaula was in custody. These ripple effects underscore a reality often seen in true crime cases, that the harm extends far beyond the immediate act, affecting entire families and communities. There were also details that emerged during the trial, but were not fully explored in front of the jury due to legal limitations on evidence. For example, statements suggesting that Perez may have feared for his safety prior to the incident were mentioned but not formally presented as part of the prosecution's case. This highlights the complexity of legal proceedings, where not all potentially relevant information is admissible, and where the outcome must be based strictly on what is allowed within the rules of evidence. Case 6. Shaquan Duley. On an August morning in 2010, a quiet stretch of road in South Carolina became the center of a tragedy that would ripple through a community and raise unsettling questions about truth, desperation, and the hidden struggles behind closed doors. Shaquan Duley was a 29-year-old mother living in Orangeburg County, South Carolina. By many accounts, her life had been marked by mounting pressure. She was unemployed, struggling financially, and raising 3 children with limited support. Reports indicate she had been dealing with emotional distress, possibly depression, and conflicts within her family. On August 16, 2010, those pressures would culminate in an event that shocked the nation. That morning, authorities were alerted to what initially appeared to be a car accident. A vehicle had gone into the North Edisto River, and inside were 2 young children, 2-year-old Devine and 18-month-old Javon. Their mother, Shaquan Duley, told a story that seemed, at first, tragically plausible. She claimed she had fallen asleep at the wheel, causing the car to veer off the road and into the water. But almost immediately, investigators began to notice inconsistencies. There were no skid marks on the road. There was no visible damage to the bridge or surrounding area that would suggest a crash. The scene did not align with her account. As authorities looked closer, the narrative began to unravel. According to investigators, Duley had not accidentally driven into the river. Instead, they believed she had gone to a boat landing, exited the vehicle, and allowed it to roll into the water. This discovery shifted the case from a tragic accident to something far more disturbing. Under questioning, Duley eventually confessed to a different version of events. Prosecutors later stated that she had suffocated her 2 sons earlier that night in a motel room. Afterward, she placed their bodies into their car seats and drove to the river, where she staged the scene to resemble an accident. The details were deeply disturbing and for many difficult to comprehend. As the investigation continued, more context emerged about Duley's state of mind leading up to the incident. Reports indicated she had been struggling with depression, failing online classes, and facing ongoing financial hardship. There had also been tension within her family, including arguments about her ability to care for her children. Authorities suggested that these stressors may have contributed to her actions, though they emphasized that such factors do not excuse or justify the outcome. Her defense later presented arguments related to her mental health, stating that she had been in a deeply distressed and possibly unstable state. There were claims that she had attempted to take her own life multiple times shortly after the deaths of her children, including overdosing on medication and attempting to harm herself with a box cutter. According to her attorney, she had initially intended to remain in the car as it entered the river, but ultimately changed her mind and escaped. Despite these claims, a court-appointed forensic psychiatrist concluded that while Duley did suffer from mental illness, she was still capable of understanding right from wrong at the time of the crime. This distinction would prove critical in the legal proceedings that followed. In March 2012, nearly 2 years after the deaths of her sons, Shaquan Duley pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. There was no plea deal with prosecutors, meaning she faced a sentencing range of 30 years to life in prison. During the hearing, she spoke briefly, expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness from her family and the community. She also stated that she loved her children and found some comfort in the memories she still had of them. The courtroom proceedings were described as emotional. Family members spoke on her behalf, portraying her as a caring person who had shown love toward her children in the past. At the same time, prosecutors emphasized the severity of the crime and the vulnerability of the victims, highlighting that the case involved not only murder, but the loss of 2 very young lives at the hands of their own mother. Judge Edgar Dixon ultimately sentenced Duley to 35 years in prison. In delivering the sentence, he acknowledged her acceptance of responsibility, but made it clear that the punishment reflected the gravity of her actions. He stated that nothing about the sentence diminished the horror of what had occurred or the impact on the victims, their family, and the wider community. Thank you for watching until the end. If you found this video interesting or informative, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories. Your support really helps the channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you carefully researched cases. Let me know in the comments which case stayed with you the most. See you in the next video.